with so many heroic people who took part in the anti-Castro days and the revolution to take down tyranny and oppression. And that's what the theme of today is going to be about. And I love the passion of the Cuban people, and particularly the mayor, who was so passionate he spilled the coffee all over. Not on purpose. But it was Cuban coffee. And so it was, but you know, Michael McCaul from Austin, Texas, but I feel, even though I'm a little bit Scotch-Irish and English, I feel Cuban in my heart. And I'm honored to be here with my colleagues in Congress, Mr. Moskowitz, who's on the Foreign Affairs Committee, to María Díaz-Balart, the Dean of the Florida delegation. He and I are working hand in glove. I authorize on the Foreign Affairs Committee the laws, and he spends the money. He has the power of the purse, which is a very powerful position to be in Congress. And Representative Waltz, my dear friend, who served in the military, was stationed for 70 years, and serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and a great asset to me and to Congress, and to Deputy Wasserman Schultz, who came in with me. We were classmates, gosh, almost 20 years ago. It's hard to imagine. We haven't aged a bit.
Yeah.
And of course, María Salazar, who we all know, very passionate, as most Cubans are, but very passionate for the people and to Cuba Libre. She is a rock star in Congress, and she is, I had no hesitation to appoint her to be the chairwoman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee. She's doing a great job. So I have some remarks briefly, and I'm going to turn to the other members. I'll try to keep it brief, though. But also, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize probably the living history, and that's Felix Rodriguez of the Brigade 2506 Museum. Where is Felix? Is he, right here. There he is. Felix, I'm going to spend some time with you after this. I mean, he's walking history, and you know, the man who helped bring down Che Guevara, Castro's executioner. What a story, sir, and thank you for your service, especially in that little three-letter agency called the CIA. This institution really ensures that we don't forget. We don't forget the sacrifices made by so many brave Cubans for the cause of freedom. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Again, I'd like to thank our guests as well, our panelists, Ms. Rosa Maria Payá. Thank you, Rosa. We've all heard about your father's experience, his dedication, sacrifice. I know we'll be naming a street in downtown Miami.
Oh, yeah.
Over here. And I'll be the one in DC when it goes off. But congratulations to that. And I'd also like to thank Ivan Hernandez Carrillo, whereas okay, that's right. We have a recorded message from Cuba, which would be really amazing to hear from a dissident from Cuba as we sit here in freedom. Tomorrow is the second anniversary of the historic protests against the Cuban regime. And I remember being here 2 years ago. Mario, you and I were here talking about that event. On July 11th, 2021, tens of thousands of Cubans took to the streets nationwide to protest the communist regime in response to longstanding rights and these restrictions they have against freedom and the tyranny that's and oppression that's in that island. They were the largest protests in decades, and while they were peaceful, they were met with unspeakable brutality in the streets. 2 years later, nearly 800 Cubans, including over 100 minors, remained detained for their participation, just expressing their right of protest, their free speech. People like Michael Absorbo, who could not accept the Latin Grammy for Patria y Vida because he was sitting in a maximum security prison where he remains today. Or Jose Daniel Ferrer, who was arrested on July 11th. According to his family, he has been held in solitary confinement since August 14th, 2021, and is in poor health. I want to assure everyone here today, and especially the Cuban Americans, and those desperately seeking freedom from just 90 miles away from where we sit here today, that my colleagues and I will never rest, we'll never stop advocating for their immediate release. In fact, tomorrow, I'm proud to introduce a bipartisan, bicameral resolution, along with my colleagues, Representatives Wasserman Schultz, María Díaz-Balart, Chairman Menendez of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Rubio, to commemorate the 2-year anniversary of the historic July 11th pro-democracy protest. This bicameral resolution ensures that human rights remains at the core of our Cuba policy, not engagement with the Castro regime. As members of Congress and Americans, we have an obligation to support the Cuban people in their aspiration for freedom. This is not just a moral imperative, it's a national security requirement. And to that end, it is a great concern that Cuba is working closely with the Chinese Communist Party. Not only have they had a long-term relationship, participating in Belt and Road Initiative, the recent intelligence highlights the growing CCP influence that poses a clear threat, clear present danger to our U.S. national security. Reports have detailed that a CCP spy station 90 miles off the coast of Florida, which may have been operational as far back as 2019. And it takes me back to the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even more concerning are CCP negotiations to establish a military facility on Cuba's northern coast, which can position CCP troops at America's doorstep. This cannot be tolerated. Just like Fidel Castro allowed the Soviets to use Cuba as a foothold into the Western Hemisphere, the CCP has similar ambitions. History has shown that weakness invites aggression, which only emboldens dictators such as Miguel Diaz-Canel and Chairman Xi of China. We must address the encroaching CCP influence with the seriousness it commands. The Cuban people deserve to live in freedom, and not under Cuban or Chinese communist oppression. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. It really gives me a great sense of pride. Today I am a Cuban at heart. I stand with the people, the Cuban Americans here. We stand with the freedom fighters. We stand with you until we finally take back that island and restore democracy and freedom as it justly deserves. So with that, I'd like to turn to the chairwoman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, Ms. Maria Salazar.
It's an honor for all of us that you are here, you being the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also Representative. We are delighted not only that you said the word sacred ground, which indeed we are in sacred ground because of the sacrifice that these men and women did 60 years ago during the United States invasion, but also the fact that you really feel, and we know it, you really feel the Cuban cause. María Díaz-Balart, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, myself, Carlos Jimenez, we all represent this community. That it's after 60 years, we're still trying to bring freedom to that island. We were born in the United States, gladly, and we have the privilege of being first generation Cuban Americans, but we cannot forget what our ancestors lived and what the Cubans on the island are still living. I thank my good friend Wasserman Schultz, Representative Wasserman Schultz, my good friend Mr. Moskowitz for being here, for understanding the Cuban cause, and for being your ally and becoming one of your army in trying to find that freedom that the Cubans want. I always say that Cubans, the story that the Cuban regime has been saying to the rest of the world, Europe, that there is this Cuban exceptionality, meaning that the Cuban people are like the Martians, that they want freedom, democracy, freedom of free market economy, capitalism. It's a lie. The Cubans are just like anybody else in the Western Hemisphere. They want freedom, they want to travel, they want to feed their kids, they want to be able to marry, study, be whatever thing they want to find happiness according to their own means. But unfortunately, the Cuban regime is in the business of power. And that is why they have been able to take that repressive apparatus to scientific levels that has not allowed those people, just like everybody else in the Western Hemisphere, reach what we are trying to bring to them. So we thank you very much, not only you, my members, my other members, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for understanding what's happening. One of the things that I want to point out to you is that the United States has been the only constant ally during this time. Sometimes we have Europe, sometimes we have Latin America, sometimes we have the Asian countries, but the United States has been the only constant ally siding with the Cuban people, not with the regime. And we very much appreciate that. That's why I am honored to be the chairman of the subcommittees on the Americas and be able to say thanks to the United States publicly. And I'm sure that my words resonate with the people that are here this afternoon. Now we have the problem is that once again the Castro brothers, who are in the business of power, are selling the island and its 11 million residents, the poor Cuban people. Before it was to Russia, now it's to China. And you were saying, specifically, China has 4 spy bases and 4 spy bases. Now they are planning to create a new facility, training facility, where the Chinese troops can be based. So can you imagine now we're going to have Chinese troops being trained 90 miles away from here, from our home? That is not possible. Not only that, the 4 spy bases. And on top of that, the Russian bases, Lourdes, that apparently they're trying to revamp. And on top of that, for the first time, the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, visited Cuba for the first time. So now we have the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians, all 90 miles away. And the question is that the Biden administration needs to be aware, and we, out of this committee, we need to be sending the message that this cannot happen. Once again, 2 years ago, tomorrow, the Cubans said no more. And once again, the repressive apparatus that has scientific levels at this hour was able to repress them. And in the last year, 2% of the population decided to leave, most of them coming to the United States. 2% of the Cuban population left in the last year. Why? Because unfortunately, they calculate that the regime is invincible and it's better to leave than to fight. We are here, and certainly we're going to see it, Chairman McCaul. We're going to see the day when those Cubans come back to reconstruct that island, and hopefully we will all be there to see it and to help them. Thank you once again. And thank you. Like you said, you're from Austin, Texas. Now you're saying that you are Cuban too. We thank you very much once again, because the United States has been there for us and will be there for us in the future. Thank you. Thank you. On behalf of the Cuban Exile community.
And let me just say, we're not here as Republicans or Democrats. We're here as Americans, standing for Cuba, for Cuban Americans, for freedom. When we travel abroad, Debbie, as you know, and you'll know soon, we stand as Americans. We don't have our political stripes. We have our American stripes, and that's very, very important. So, with that, I want to recognize the dean of the Florida delegation, the esteemed chairman of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee on the Powerful Appropriations Committee, Mr. Mario Díaz-Balart.
The Cardinal.
Little introduction here, but and he is a Cardinal. I'm Catholic, but that means something else to me.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, first, thank you for honoring this community and this sacred hall with your presence, but more importantly, with your effort and your solidarity. And thank you for allowing those of us that are not on your committee to also sit in on this very important meeting. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, for so many years, we've been talking about how this cancer in the island of Cuba has not only been a cancer to its own people, but it's been a national security threat to the United States. And we've seen, you know, example after example. Chairwoman Salazar just mentioned, you know, the presence of Iran, of Russia, of China, the fact that they harbor fugitives from U.S. law. And yet, for so many years, we've heard from some saying, well, don't worry about it. It's not a problem. It's a huge national security risk to the United States, and it's a nightmare for the Cuban people and for people in this hemisphere that cannot be allowed to continue. And so that's why your solidarity is so important, and to my colleagues from both parties who are here. Let me tell you a little bit about the work in the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee of Appropriations, which I chair. And Mr. Chairman, none of what we are doing could have happened without your dedication, your cooperation with me, and your staff's cooperation as well. So while we have some obviously partisan difference in that bill, there are some issues that I've had bipartisan requests to make it in this bill, and that's why I also want to thank my fellow appropriator, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's been in this fight, in the struggle for freedom, by the way, in this hemisphere, in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but across the planet, you know, since she's been in Congress, and so it's been a privilege to work with her. So while we have some disagreement, and that's fine, that's fair, and that's subcommittee, let me tell you some things that I've got, that I put in the bill. This is just a few of them that have been asked, and have been requested in a bipartisan way. We are increasing funding for the Cuba Democracy programs to $30 million. We are increasing funding for broadcasts into the island that had been severely reduced over the number of years. We added an additional $5 million for the Open Technology Fund that can only be used to expand technologies into Cuba, to get communication within Cuba, and for the Cubans to be able to communicate among themselves and outside of the island, something that we have been working on for some time, and we've not gotten a lot of cooperation from the administration. But there's strong cooperation because, again, these are issues that are in the bill because we've had bipartisan requests for them. And there's so many other things. We also included language, by the way, which states very clearly, if you are a country and you receive U.S. aid and you are trafficking in Cuban doctors, you will not get $1 of American aid. You will not continue to particular countries that are receiving human aid. And we also have language to encourage our European partners who continuously ask, and you know, I'm one who's supported funding for the Ukraine, to telling them that you can't ask for the U.S. to help in the Ukraine while at the same time you are out there helping the allies of Russia in this case. So we are asking for consistency. This is just some of the things that we have in that legislation, and there are going to be a lot of issues that we disagree on, but I will tell you I'm grateful that these are issues that have strong bipartisan support from the members that are here. And Debbie, thank you for your solidarity. Thank you for your solidarity. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned where your heart is. Your heart is always been. Your heart has always been there for all of those who are struggling for freedom, who are fighting for freedom, whether it's in Hong Kong, whether it's Communist China, whether it's Iran, whether it's in Venezuela, Nicaragua, in North Korea, and in Cuba. You have always been there. The United States Congress is fortunate. The American people are fortunate to have you as chairman of this exceedingly important committee. And I, for one, am grateful for your leadership, and yes, grateful for your friendship. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mario. He's my band of brothers in the Congress, and you know, we we stand for freedom everywhere around the world against tyranny, whether it be Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. You know, we look back to Ronald Reagan, I do, who stood down the Soviet Union and stood for the freedom fighters, stood for freedom. Whether Republican or Democrat, we all stand for that. So with that, I want to recognize Mr. Moskowitz, who is from this area, the greater Miami area, a new member of Congress.
But your Broward considers itself Greater Miami.
It's like, whatever.
But Greater Miami would like it.
Not greater than, not greater than.
It's a little, yeah, it's close enough. A little short story. We had dinner with the Taiwanese ambassador and talked about a fight for freedom against oppression right next door to Communist China. And I was very inspired by not only his intelligence, but his wit. He's got a great sense of humor.
You're setting the bar.
And trying to make you look good back home. You know? So without further ado, I turn to you.
Hey, it's going to be underwhelming. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate, first of all, you having the roundtable this morning, coming to South Florida and marking the second anniversary of the July 11th protests in Cuba. What we witnessed 2 years ago was an historic demonstration against tyranny and oppression. We saw thousands of people take to the streets to protest the regime and call for freedom and democracy. The human rights abusers who cling to power in Cuba are backed by similarly minded despots who seek to snuff out any spark of opposition. Even as the Cuban people continue to push for rights that we enjoy here in the United States, Cuba's authoritarian regime is tightening the military and economic ties with Putin and with Xi. It's vitally important that we stand with the Cuban people in their struggle. As you can see from the members here today on a bipartisan basis, and Mr. Chairman, to your credit, because I serve on the Oversight Committee in addition to Foreign Affairs, and I can tell you it's nice that Foreign Affairs is conducted in a bipartisan fashion. And you're right. I mean, I had the opportunity to go on a CODEL with Speaker McCarthy, and when we left the country, we were all Americans, and that is important, and that's what we're doing here. That's what we're doing here today. And so, I agree with my colleague that Cuba is a national security issue, and we should treat it as such. And so, as someone whose grandparents escaped fascism and authoritarianism in Poland and Germany and Czechoslovakia, you know, I stand with the Cuban people. We all stand with the Cuban people in their fight for freedom. And I will continue to be a voice. I appreciate Debbie Wasserman-Schultz's work on this as someone that I'm trying to emulate what she's done in this area. And so I want to thank everyone for being here today and participating in this roundtable. And I look forward to learning more and listening to the discussion. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Next, we have a very honored, decorated veteran that I'm very proud to serve with. We call him a friend of mine and my colleague. He's on not only Foreign Affairs Committee, he's on the Armed Services Committee, and also on the House Intelligence Committee. I don't know how you keep up with all three of those very important national security committees, but when I need to turn to someone for national security advice, Michael Waltz is who I talk to. And so, sir, with that, I recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and what an honor it is to be here. Some folks have asked me, you drove all the way down. I represent and live in St. Augustine, and I'll tell you why. Well, I'll tell you why. One, a lot of folks don't realize that Batista came to Daytona. There's an entire wing of the art museum in Daytona dedicated to Cuban art and dedicated to the freedom fighters and to opposing the Castro regime. But secondly, and this is what comes from my heart, like Felix, I'm a colonel, I'm a Green Beret. I've spent my entire life, 27 years now in the Army. Green Berets specialize in guerrilla warfare and partnering with freedom fighters all over the world. So whether it was the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the Contras opposing the FARC, the reason I'm here and all of us are here is we hate and will always oppose communism.
Amen. More amen.
We are willing to die for our freedoms. We are willing to die for other people's freedoms. And we need to say loud and clear, bipartisan, as Americans, communism has killed more people around the world than fascism, colonialism, or any other type of ism have died at the hands of communist regimes. The only thing equitable about communism is everyone's equally poor and repressed. But listen, today's not about us. Today is about the true freedom fighters of the Assault Brigade and about the new generation of freedom fighters that we are recognizing and celebrating. So what do we do about it, aside from showing solidarity and showing strength? We do the things that Representative Díaz-Balart just did in his bill. We have to, I say three things. We have to help today's freedom fighters communicate. And that's what that new technology fund's designed to do. You know what, if we can put Starlink over Ukraine, we can put it over Cuba. And Representative Salazar has a bill that I've signed on to designed to do that. There are ways, overtly and covertly, we can help these freedom fighters communicate. The regime hates that. They're afraid of it. We have to isolate the regime. We have to cut the ties between Maduro and his repressive regime and his support of the Castro regime. And we have to cut the new ties with the Chinese Communist Party. And then I think finally, they need to know, both the regime and the freedom fighters need to know that we stand with them. The regime wants us to forget. We're not going to forget. We're not going to let this get stuffed under the rug. We will stand strong. They will hear from us. And I want them to know, we have a saying in the military, never forget, not forgotten. We will never forget our fallen brothers. And Felix, Raphael, others, we learn as Green Berets in our training. We learn about you. You are walking history. We know how, we learn in our survival school how these political prisoners resist. You know, it's one thing for us to talk the talk. They walk the walk in their fight for freedom. And I just want you to know, from my foxhole, from our perspective, you will never, ever, ever be forgotten. And I want the regime to hear and the freedom fighters to hear that they are not forgotten. We stand.
Michael, and I think back to my father's generation, the greatest. He was a bomber on a B-17 bomb, the Nazis, 32 bombing missions, but it was the Green Berets that led the charge, Colonel Rudder up to Point du Hoc, and won the battle at Omaha Beach. And that was a great cause of freedom. So thank you to the Green Berets as well. Wow, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I know her probably longer than anybody here. We go back to our, but we were classmates. And while we were at different parties, I sometimes feel like she's my sister. And she thinks I'm misguided, being Republican. It's okay. I tell her she needs to learn some things about being a Republican. So, but she's great because she does know how to be bipartisan, and we appreciate that. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, thank you for taking this show on the road, because it is so much more than a show. It is a show of solidarity and of defiance and of American leadership. And having this briefing, this community meeting here, is as close as we are to Cuba, is so critical, because we know they're watching. We know that their eyes are on this hearing. They might be making it difficult for the Cuban people, the average Cuban person, to get access to the internet, but they haven't. And I'm sure that somewhere one of their lackeys is live streaming this, and we're all going to make sure, by being here together, that we send them a strong message that we're going to number their days of oppression. That is something that we need to focus on every single day. And recognizing the anniversary of the July 2021 protests and the brutality of the regime's response, and underscoring the tragic situation that exists in Cuba today still is critical. And I have spent proudly with my brother Mario Díaz-Balart, and we don't, you know, you would think we use that term loosely. There are precious few people outside of my own brother, who's my biological brother, that I would call with that moniker. And Mario and I have gone back all the way to our days, our much younger days in the state legislature. So 30 years or so now. Actually, we're beyond 30 years. And yeah, I know. And but it's important that we highlight that, because this is none of our first rodeo, and we're building our numbers in Congress. And each of us takes personal responsibility in making sure that as new members are elected, and I'm so glad that Darren Moskowitz has joined the Congress, joined the fight. He gave voice to the fight when he was a state legislator, and now we're able to really get him in the weeds. And it's especially meaningful that we're convening this briefing and this discussion here in Hialeah Gardens, which is a beating heart of the Cuban people. South Florida is so different than the rest of the country. In South Florida, foreign policy, especially as it relates to our neighbor 90 miles away, is domestic policy. It is everyday, in our face policy. And that's why we are all as well versed in these issues as we are, and that human rights is a fight we take on every single day. This neighborhood, like so many in our community, provides a striking illustration of the contributions that it's made to our own culture and our community and our democracy, and the ties that bind us to the Cuban people and to our cause. 2 years ago, I stood alongside Cuban friends and neighbors marching to the tune of Elvira in support of their brothers and sisters who are under siege. The frustrations, the pain, and the anger that drove thousands of Cubans to speak out, that didn't happen out of thin air. That wasn't just some magical fabrication. Every human right that we hold dear is under continual assault in Cuba. Imagine the frustration of living every day not knowing whether you're going to have electricity or water, or if you're going to be arrested just for expressing your opinion. No one should believe the gauzy, shiny stories that are coming out now about how there's an emergence of a private sector and a thriving so-called business community in Cuba. I mean, please, that is so much a part of what we need to disabuse the public of, and certainly the media here today. Every avenue of political participation that many take for granted in the United States remains a distant dream for Cubans. These protests resulted from decades of enduring an authoritarian regime that has not only failed to meet the needs of its people, but instead doubles down on violence, torture, and repression to curtail fundamental human rights. For a dictatorship that rules through fear, there is nothing more terrifying than fearless hope and optimism. They are deathly afraid that hope and optimism will ebb like a rising tide that lifts all boats. In response, they shut down the internet, surveil social media, control the streets, bang down doors. They brandish weapons in response to words and meet rallies with retribution and imprisonment. They are thugs who thrive on silence and lies, who are authorized to lash out against real patriots, armed with nothing but the truth. But that did not stop Cuban dissidents from risking everything for a chance at freedom. We can't let those calls go unanswered. That's why we're here today. We cannot forget the 1,000+ political prisoners facing decades of torture under inhumane conditions. We cannot accept that democracy remains a generation away. I'm proud to have worked with you, Mr. Chairman, a classmate, for many years. We're going on 20. And our colleagues that are here today, thank you for driving down with a 1-year-old. That's really admirable. To aid the Cuban people in their aspirations for human rights and self-determination, you must continue to work in a bipartisan manner. It happens. We do need to stress for you that even though the media really focuses, and there is a lot of divisiveness, but we know how to come together when it really matters. And despite everything we've seen over the last 2 years, I maintain that the July 11th protests were a turning point for the Cuban democracy movement. Don't let anyone tell you different. And we need to make sure we uplift the Cuban people and undergird their passionate desire that will ultimately be achieved. Viva Cuba Libre.
Thank you, Debbie. Now I'd like to turn to our panelists. I want to thank all three of you for being here today. And Rosa, Maria, Payá needs a little introduction. We all know her, and we know her father's story and struggle for freedom. And we're just so honored Maria, to have you here today. Rosa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for bringing this much needed bipartisan support to the Cuban American community and to the Cuban people. I, of course, have to recognize the host, the Brigada 2500, as we call it, and your sacrifice. Thank you so much for hosting us, and also thank you to all my friends and colleagues from the Cuban democratic movement that are here today, all those that are in Cuba, all those that are following this hearing very closely and that have been fighting, not only for the freedom for the Cuban people, but also to mobilize the international community to support that demand. Today, Felix Navarro turns 70 years old in an squalid prison. He was imprisoned in July 12 after going to the police station to ask about those disappeared the day before. His daughter, Saili, who accompanied him, was also sentenced to 8 years in prison. Today, she's not going to be able to see his family. Tomorrow, Jose Daniel Ferrer will mark 2 years in prison, where he has been tortured and isolated, like hundreds of other political prisoners in Cuba today. The cruelty is so intense that some have started hunger strikes demanding freedom, like Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara did 4 days ago. On July 11, 2021, the people of Cuba went out into the streets throughout the entire island, province by province, and asked for libertad. Libertad. Patria y vida. That mobilization continues today. As you may know, the Havana regime answer was brutal. They took state terrorism to the next level, intensifying repression, killing and disappearing of peaceful protesters, and forcing into exile or imprisoning thousands of people. Today, there are still over 1,000 political prisoners in the island. Furthermore, the government has plunged the Cuban people into a deep economic crisis, characterized by the failure of the essential systems, runaway inflation, shortages, and hunger. The world might think that this brutality doesn't affect them. But the reality is that tolerating 64 years of communism in Cuba has made democratic stability in our continent impossible, and is increasingly threatening the U.S. national security. For instance, you already mentioned at least 367,000 Cubans have irregularly crossed the southern border of the U.S., creating a migratory crisis that was a coordinated breakfast operation between the Havana regime and their terror regimes. Aiming what? Aiming to release internal pressure, aiming also to destabilize the U.S., but also to infiltrate Cuban agents into U.S. territory. You already talked about Russia. From the first day of the invasion to Ukraine, from the first day, the Cuban regime and the Russian regime have been strengthening the military alliance. The milk payment platform was just settled on the island. And the Russian ambassador said bluntly that that's going to enable them to circumvent the sanctions that the US government and Europe has imposed on Russia. We have to assume that everything that we knew about the Chinese interference in Cuba is even worse. We already know that there is military presence, intelligence presence, and espionage bases from China on our territory. But going back to the Cuban people, despite the oppression, the exodus, the hunger, and the lack of international support, the Cuban people continue to fight. During 2022, more than 3,000 protests were released, and they continue till today. Because we are convinced that in order to get out of the crisis, we must get rid of the dictatorship. We at Cuba Decide propose a roadmap to do so, mobilizing the citizenry and the international community to create a kind of critical mass that ensures that the regime has no other choice but to give in to the will of the people and live as Cubans decide our own future. The steps are obvious. recognition of human rights as fundamental freedom, a binding plebiscite for system change, transition process, and free and multi-party elections. That's our aim. That is how we follow the legacy of my father, Oswaldo Payá, prominent civic leader who mobilized thousands of citizens demanding change of system. Almost 11 years ago, the Castro brothers ordered the murder of Carlos Cepeda and my father. It took more than 10 years for the Inter-American Commissioning of Human Rights to pronounce its verdict, holding the Cuban regime responsible for their death. Only 2 days after that, last June, the Oswaldo Payá Way bill was unanimously passed by the U.S. Senate to rename the street in front of the Cuban embassy in D.C. after my father. An identical bill has been referred to the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability. It was sponsored by Representative Mario Díaz-Balart, Representative David McCaul, Representative María Salazar, Representative Jimenez. It is time to pass that bill. Because it is time that the Cuban regime to receive the message that there will be no impunity. Not for my father, nor for any of the thousands of past and present victims of the dictatorship. It is time for his murderers to say his name on the Oswaldo Payá. So, in addition to the passage of the Oswaldo Payá Way bill, I will conclude with some policy recommendations for the U.S. administration which we encourage you to support and advocate for. The U.S. government should stop all concessions to the regime and create an international effort, a coalition of nations in support of the Cuban people's call for freedom with the aim of denouncing the legitimacy of the Cuban regime and supporting the change of system in Cuba towards democracy and freedom. The U.S. should vastly expand the use of individual and targeted sanctions to include Cuban regime officials overseeing joint military projects with Chinese People's Liberation Army, security service agents involved in the killing of my father and other opposition leaders, the imprisonment of all the political prisoners, state administrators that operate state enterprises, as well as family members, close associates, and foreign business partners that serve as intermediaries in the illicit transactions designed to circumvent U.S. sanctions. For example, you could make full use of the Global Magnitsky Act. Third, recognize the Cuban pro-democracy movement as legitimate interlocutors of the Cuban people. Fourth, advocate for the EU to take similar actions as the bill that Representative Balart is pushing in Congress. 5, initiate a review process of energy in the Paris Club to freeze all financing from that entity to the Cuban regime. 6, the U.S. should provide uncensored internet access covering the Cuban territory, overcoming the regime's interference as Representative Salazar is pushing. 8, the U.S. should keep the Cuba on the list of countries sponsoring terrorism. 9, demand that any economic aid, commerce, or cooperation be directly delivered to the Cuban citizens, excluding the military repressors, their representatives, and their frontmen. In summary, the dictators must not get any concessions, no negotiations, no trade credit, and targeted sanctions. Maximum public shaming and diplomatic pressure should be maintained until the unconditional release of all political prisoners is achieved, an end to the repression is realized, respect for freedom of expression, association, religion, reunion, and economic freedom is upheld. All necessary measures are implemented to enable the people to express themselves and decide sovereignly on a transition to a democratic system through a binding plebiscite leading to free, fair, and multi-party elections. The Cuban regime ceases its support for China's expansion of its military, security, espionage presence on the island and the rest of Latin America, as well as the regime support for Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. The Cuban regime ceases all attempts to destabilize the democratic order of foreign states in Latin America and the neighborhood of migratory crisis. In conclusion, the Cuban regime is the Berlin Wall of the Americas. And the USA should lead the global effort against it, like the one that took down the Iron Curtain 30 years ago. That is to support the Cuban people's effort for freedom, democratic change, peace, and prosperity.
Thank you, Rosa. I know the bill naming the street across from the embassy is and your father's name is in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. So I will turn to my colleague, Mr. Moskowitz. That will be his assignment when class is adjourned. We'll see you back in Washington.
Yeah, I'll get Cobra right on that.
So next, we have a distinguished author, a very prolific Dr. Gutiérrez-Boronat. Orlando, your works, particularly your works on Cuba, the doctrine of the lie, very powerful piece of literature. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And sir, thank you for being here today, and I recognize you.
Well, I want to start by thanking Chairman McCaul for hosting and organizing this meeting. I want to thank each one of you, each one of the members of Congress here, for your dedication, your energy, your moral strength in supporting community Cuba. I think the leadership you've given in the House, in Congress in general, has been the true pillar of support for Cuban people of these years. I am here proudly representing the Assembly of Cuban Recipients. It's a coalition of 41 organizations inside and outside Cuba. Many of them are here present as representatives. And we are very dedicated, very intent on continuing our programmatic struggle in order to empower the Cuban people for change from within. Today in my presentation, I want to zero in on several key aspects. And everything I state is documented. I can provide the backup for it. The first thing I want to do is I want to zero in so that the level of subordination of the regime in Cuba to Beijing and Moscow is best understood. I want to zero in on an essential organization which was basic to the regime to crush what happened on July 11th, and it's a fundamental knot of the alliance, the subordination to Russia and China. I want to talk about the Cuban Black Berets. The Cuban Black Berets are the anti-Green Berets. They're the bizarro Green Berets. They're a special force within the Ministry of the Interior, which specializes in counterinsurgency. On July 11th, the one force that responded to the regime wholeheartedly were the Black Berets. They were in charge of repression. The response of the National Revolutionary Police was lackluster. In some areas they repressed, in others they didn't. The army was not used. 27 Cuban generals had died after July 11, 2021. In my day, they called that a purge. Now they call it COVID. I don't believe the excuse of the regime about that being COVID. The Black Berets were also essential in crushing the Pro-Democracia uprising in Nicaragua in 2018. And it's documented that this unit, which is 4,000 to 5,000 men strong, has been trained by the Chinese People's Armed Police for at least the past 5 years. Pictures have appeared of a military base where this training is happening. So the presence of Chinese troops, of Chinese armed forces in Cuba training these special forces of the regime is not something new, it's something that's already started. The Black Berets are also an essential part of Cuban intelligence. And it's important that we point out that since at least 2012, Raul Castro's son, Alejandro Castro, signed 3 protocol agreements with the GRU, integrating Cuban and Russian intelligence. They function as a unit, and they have been functioning as a unit for years. Also, I want to add that progressively, what the Russians and the Chinese have gotten us used to is the presence of Russian warships in Cuba that can carry any type of weapon and can fire any type of weapon. The presence of high-ranking Chinese military advisors constantly in the island. And the fact, which I think is most notorious, that the unit being sent to Belarus for unspecified training as a result of the agreement between Belarus and the communist regime in Cuba are precisely these black berets. So these black berets are near the tactical nuclear weapons that Putin has placed in Belarus, and they're also in Belarus to learn about counterinsurgency and how to repress popular movements. I also want to point out and emphasize the presence of so-called Cuban volunteers in Ukraine fighting alongside the Russian army against the people of Ukraine in the genocidal Russian aggression. Volunteers with the same facade used by the Cuban Soviet proxy army in Angola to engage in combat in that country to set up a family dictatorship of the MPLA. In one day alone, on May 27, 1977, these so-called Cuban volunteers massacred between 30,000 and 90,000 civilians. This is all important to point out because one often hears the excuse of Cuban engagers that the regime in Cuba is somehow accidentally authoritarian. It's not accidentally authoritarian. It didn't wander into dictatorship trying to defend social justice. It is intentionally totalitarian. And this regime, since it came to power in 1959, has done everything it can, in spite of repeated attempts by the U.S. to normalize relations, to overthrow the rules-based international order led by the United States and Europe. The presence of Cuban troops in Ukraine and Belarus is a continuing effort on that by the regime to do that, with the exception that now they perceive greater American weakness. Just remember that even at the moments of greatest opening by the U.S. to Cuba, during the Obama administration, the regime used that openness to consolidate its control over Venezuela and also to serve as host for the directed energy attacks against U.S. personnel. In closing, I want to emphasize this point. An uprising didn't happen in Cuba on July 11, 2021. An uprising began on July 11, 2021, and it hasn't ceased. Every week, there are multiple forms of resistance undertaken by Cuban people in a very obvious and frontal way against the regime. Why was this July 11, 2021 uprising? Why has it been the most successful so far in a long history of uprisings of the Cuban people against dictatorship? Because U.S. sanctions, tough U.S. sanctions, which are still being applied, have crippled the regime's base of informants. Without that, repression is very difficult. However, while U.S. sanctions cripple the regime's base of informants, the European Union's assistance to the regime is renewing that base of informants. The European Union is giving the regime 155 million euros per year for 80 projects that finance the regime grassroots organizations which repress. The U.S. Congress has been a pillar of support for Cuban freedom, not now, since the wars of independence. To achieve the liberation of Cuba, we need a broad, cohesive plan of action. Many of the fundamental points of that plan were presented by Mario in the legislation he is advocating. But I think also there are three legal instruments which are essential in formulating an effective Cuban policy. There's no reason to accept a status quo where the regime continues to survive. Every day the regime gains goes against the United States. It's an existential enemy of the United States. These three laws, which should be the legal basis of a comprehensive plan for the liberation of Cuba, are the Joint Resolution of 1898, Public Law 87733 from October 1962, and the Libertad Act. The three conditions of the Libertad Act are essential: release of all political prisoners, legalization of Cuban civil society, and free multi-party elections. Like María said, Cubans are not Martians. Cubans have the same right to the same things all Latin American Cubans. I think this is a mid-term to long-term objective to achieve this comprehensive plan of liberation for Cuba, just as it was done for Poland and for Nicaragua. But in the meantime, I would like to point out the two specific measures Congress can do now. One is, as a group of you already did, insist with the European Union to cease its funding for the regime. It's morally incoherent and strategically suicidal. It's time that the Spanish government, especially the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, stop serving as a bodyguard for the regime. But most essential, it is important that the Club of Paris cease financing the regime. The U.S. is a founding member and permanent member of the Pro-Democracia. Supposedly our money hasn't gone in the loans given to the Castro regime, but the couple of Paris in the past 3 years has given the Castro regime $8.1 billion. That hasn't gone to improve the lives of the Cuban people. It's probably gone to transport microwaves to Russia and to Belarus for training. So I think it's important that the permanent representative of the U.S. to the Club of Paris appear before Congress and explain what the U.S. role has been within that institution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor. We often think of the war in Ukraine and the threats in the Pacific as halfway around the world. It's hard to believe, as you narrated, it's actually 90 miles from our shore. And I'd very much like to follow up with you on that as well. Next, we have a special guest that I will not attempt to introduce, but rather yield to my distinguished colleague, Ms. Maria Salazar, to make that introduction.
And we want to acknowledge Eliezer Márquez, known as El Funky. And El Funky is very well known because he was one of the writers and one of the performers of this extraordinary piece of music called Payá, won a Latin Grammy. And unfortunately, two of your colleagues in that musical performance, McCaul is in jail. Luis Miguel Alcántara is in jail. And thank God that you are in the land of freedom. So we wanted to acknowledge you and thank you because we believe, the experts understand that because of that music, because those lyrics, the Cuban people on July 11th, 2 years ago, rose up and said, Patria y vida. So thank you. And to McCaul, who right now are in jail, that we remember them and that we are doing everything we can for them to be free. So thanks again. I also wanted to, thanks, Chairman. I think that I'm going to just the staff is telling me that we are short of time.
However, if you would like to say a few words,
Would you like to say something?
That
Sure.
time.
Do you want me to translate for you? ¿Quieres decir algo en español y yo te traduzco? Dale, levanta. I will translate for him.
Bueno, siempre nervioso con esta
I'm
situación.
always nervous with this type of situation.
Para mí es un honor
For me,
estar
it's an
aquí,
honor
haber sido partícipe
to be able
de
to
esta
be
gran
a
canción,
participant of
de
this
las
song
cosas que pasaron en el movimiento San Isidro.
and everything that happened to that movement called San Isidro.
Y hoy apenas un día de 2 años del 11 de julio,
And just barely a day before the 11th,
de
July 11th,
prisión Luis Manuel y Michael. Luis Manuel
Michael,
hoy lleva 4 días plantado en huelga de hambre y sed. No
they have
sabemos
been
hasta
for
mañana.
4 days. Wait,
Marta,
for
a
4
ver si-
days he has been, wait. He has been on hunger strike, with no water and no food for the last 4 days.
Entonces, mañana supuestamente deben darle una llamada a ver cómo está el estado, pero
Tomorrow,
hasta ahora
supposedly,
sabemos
he's going to receive a call to figure out what medical state he is in.
que sigue plantado en
Because he
huelga de hambre y sed.
is in hunger strike.
Yo hago un llamado a todos los cubanos libres
I'm calling on every
a que
free
se hagan
Cuban
eco de esto. Son 2 años de injusto encarcelamiento.
that he has been unfairly jailed for more than 2 years.
Son artistas
These are just artists,
que por su
musicians.
creación, por su inspiración,
Just
están
like
presos.
because of their inspiration and because of their music, they're in jail.
Y son líderes de nacimiento nato, por eso
They're
están detenidos.
they're just
Son
born
gente que-
leaders.
Gente que tiene el poder de convocar a un pueblo,
People that have the power to bring a hope, to rise up a whole country.
como lo hace José Daniel Ferrer, que
Like
tampoco
like
sabemos de él.
Jose Daniel Ferrer has done it, who's also in jail.
Y mi llamado y mi mensaje es para todos los cubanos libres
And I'm calling
nos hagamos
on every
eco
single free Cuban
de esta situación,
to be aware of this
de
situation,
que siguen presos niños, ancianos,
And there are so
personas
many, there are
mayores
what,
del día 11.
1,000 political prisoners, including 35 minors.
Y que estemos preparados porque el estallido social viene.
And to be very ready, because another uprising is coming.
El faro de ese pueblo, la guía, porque eso es un pueblo desconcertado que no va a saber para dónde va a coger
This is,
familia.
and that we
No
are
podemos
the beacon
repetir
of hope for that country,
ya
that they
pasó.
do not, because they don't know where they're going.
Nada, todo está en el corazón de nosotros, todos los que quieren el cambio para la isla.
Yeah, we have in our hearts the wanting to, that change, to produce that change, that political change on the island.
Y gracias por todo lo que están haciendo.
Thank you very much for everything.
Si le ponemos un poco más de fuerza, yo creo
We
que
need to put more
puede
force,
ser
we need
este
to be
año
more
antes de que
engaged in
acabe
this cause.
el 2024.
And in
Gracias, de verdad.
24, we will
Thank you, sir. What an honor. Thank you so much for being here. Perhaps when we're done with this, you can see. Next, we have Mr. Rafael Montalvo. Everybody knows him well. President of the Bay of Pigs Veterans Association and president of North Aviation as well. Was also imprisoned by the Castro regime. Sir, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be invited and to be able to say something. I feel after listening to all of you that I'm preaching to the choir here. Because, many of the things you said is what I have in here. I'm very impressed with your work here, your recommendations, and yours, and full endorsement. But I'm a voice from the past here, and I speak for the brigade. On the eve of this anniversary, I think we have to realize that we all know that Cuba's government has failed, and that the ideology has failed. That's a fact. We don't need to discuss that. But the government has more. And it's not longer a government, it's a cartel. And it functions, and I'm a businessman, it functions organizationally exactly like a cartel. And we're trying to deal with it as a government, and it is not. We have to deal with it like we would deal with the cartel, like we dealt with Noriega. The same is exactly right. The Cuban cartel is a sworn enemy of the United States and has always been, and it's been their dogma forever. They may have been communists at our time or something else at another time, but they have been enemies of the United States forever. And they're a very crafty, powerful, and unprincipled cartel. And you've seen the assassinations, the things that they have done, the shoot down of the brothers to the rescue. I mean, of 3 American citizens in there, and we did absolutely nothing, and we still haven't done anything. I mean, Raul Castro ordered that shoot down, and Raul Castro is not the head of state, and he's sitting there. They need cash right now, and the only source of cash is drugs. It's the Chinese and the Russians, and that's exactly what they're going to do. We don't need to have a magic ball to that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to extract and give away to the Russians and Chinese whatever they have to extract money. And so far they have limited the drug operation from Venezuela, and they control it, to Europe through North Africa. And they have stayed out of the United States, but that's their next step. They have said here, they send people here to put pot houses, and they run them for a year, maybe $1 million, and then those people get the money goes back to Cuba, and those people get deported to Cuba. They teach at the Department of the Americas in Cuba, which is the department that deals with the United States, which has like 1,000 employees. They teach how to do Medicare billing, and they send the people here to do. This is a fact. And they send them to do Medicare fraud, and they make millions of dollars and take it back to Cuba, and that money goes to the government. It's obviously, this cartel has no interest in the benefit of the people. Cuba is a very fertile country. In Cuba, you can plant 3 crops a year. Cuba can feed itself without any problem, and the government does not allow the cartel does not allow the people to do that. So it's not going to make a gift of freedom to the people. I think it was Martin Luther King in Birmingham that said that freedom is never given by the oppressor. And in Cuba, it's not going to be given, it's going to have to be taken away.
That's right.
And they cannot be left alone. You know, we Cubans have been allies of the United States. And I don't know if you know that we fought alongside you in your war of independence as you fought and you know in Florida. And you fought in ours. And we joined you as Cubans in both world wars. And as exiles, we have fought in every theater all over the world, in Vietnam, in all South and Central America, in Africa, and in the Middle East. And if you go to the museum, the House of the Brigade, you will see plenty of bronze medals and Purple Hearts, and even in intelligence stars, which we have one sitting right here. So we have been present and we have been there. And right now, Cuba needs your help. And it needs serious help. I mean, we are fighting. I think in the State Department, it used to be that the Cuba desk was one person. In the Cuba, the American desk is 1,000 people. And that's what you have. We really need to put a budget together that addresses this issue, and we need to put a team together that addresses this issue. I mean, this is the enemy, 90 miles away from here. This is the enemy. And, you know, 62 years ago, you know, I stood on the sands of Giron, and with an empty rifle in my hand, watching the stern of two destroyers turn around and leave. And you know, we're here because of what happened there. That's why we're here today. And we got to make sure that what we do today does not allow for this to get much worse for our children and grandchildren. So I thank you very much for letting me speak, and I totally endorse what you're doing, and I will pray that you are successful in it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. You're really living history. And as I look behind me, the people here, freedom fighters on the wall, who were with you on those days on the sandy beaches, when unfortunately your back was turned on you, American back. We should have provided air cover at that time. Not to relitigate history, I want to talk about today because, you know, I get a lot of briefings, we all do, classified. One briefing we have not been able to receive from this administration that Senator Menendez and I have called for is a classified briefing on the China spy station in Cuba. So I often turn to people that may be sources of information. Certainly, Dr. Orlando, all of you are pretty well connected to this community. What is your understanding first of China's influence in Cuba and a potential spy station? And then, Dr. Boronat, as you went into great detail, the Black Berets that are connected to the CCP and to Russia. To me, as we look at foreign nation adversaries across the globe, to look just 90 miles south and know that they're there is quite disturbing, I think, to me and to the members of Congress here today. And so perhaps if I could just start with you, Dr. Boronat, and go down the line.
Well, first of all, you know, just a week ago, the New York Times published an article saying that the regime in Cuba was going towards Russia and China because of U.S. sanctions. That's a lie. It's a lie. The regime is integrated with Russia and China. On July 11, 2021, Chinese companies were responsible for shutting down the internet so Cubans could not communicate with the outside world. In no uncertain terms, the regime in Cuba has said that China should liberate Taiwan and reincorporate it into China. That's the kind of language coming from these people. And you know, they say what they think. Fidel Castro will say what he was going to do since he came down Sierra Maestra. When we wanted to listen or not was our problem. He was saying what he was going to do, and he did it. So the regime sees its only hope for survival in overturning the international rules-based order the U.S. and Europe set up after World War II. They have found common ground with Putin and with China in that objective, and they're not going to squander any effort. They're going to do everything they can to overturn that international rules-based order because it's their only hope of survival. I think that the regime successfully benefited from the Kennedy-Khrushchev Pact in 1962. There's a very important and little-known speech by Putin, by Vladimir Putin, a few months before the invasion of Ukraine, where he said, a new Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement is needed for a new world order. I can send you that speech. And that's what we're seeing now. It's being reconstituted in Cuba, it's being reconstituted in Ukraine, in Taiwan. That is their objective, and we shouldn't lose sight of it.
When was that said?
That was said about 4 months before. It's Putin's speech on Ukraine. I'll send it to
If you would provide that to the
I will.
committee.
It's a very important speech to read.
Rafael, do you have any thoughts on this?
My only suggestion is you have to budget for this. We cannot do it with the present resources. We do not have an allocation to deal with this is serious problem. You have to organize it.
Rosa?
Yeah, just echoing what Orlando said, there is this approach that tries to convince us that the Cuban regime is partnering with China and Russia because there is no enough engagement with the U.S. government. That's not only a lie, that's designed in the headquarters of the Cuban cartel in Havana, in the headquarters of the state security. It's very important to challenge that narrative. The day that the delegation sent from the State Department to Cuba to negotiate the deportation of innocent Cubans that have been deported to the island for the crime of escaping from that dictatorship looking for freedom, and that have been deported while we talk and are being deported to the island. And that was what the State Department delegation was doing in Cuba. The day that they were leaving the island, that day, Miguel Díaz-Canel was flying out of Cuba. They're going to Russia, Moscow, and then to Beijing. That's the kind of respect that the mafia in power in Cuba has for the U.S. government.
We really need to highlight this. The American people are not aware of this. Rick?
Well, thank you, three of you. I want to start with you, Rosa. I always, every time I see you, I remember your dad. I wanted to share with you something that I brought, and with the rest of the audience. You see, in my best years, when I was a journalist, I interviewed your dad. Probably I'm one of the few people in this audience that knew him, and I can tell you, and I always have told you, I've said this to you before, but I want to say publicly that, I've interviewed Chairman thousands of people. I interviewed Fidel, so I can compare the energy of that evil monster that I had in front of me for 3 hours with your dad. Your dad was, and is not because he was your father, your biological father, it's because Payá was always, for me, one of the most honorable, decent, patriotic, good-hearted human beings. He was, and now the fact that the Inter-American Committee on Human Rights concluded officially that the Castro regime killed him, has to move our hearts and fight to bring to justice those people who killed him, because he should have not died. He was no doubt one of those beacons of hope within Cuba, someone who decided not to leave. It was a lot easier just to get on a plane and go, but he said, no, I'm going to stay. And I remembered, so I want to pay tribute to his memory in front of you and in front of the whole audience and everyone that is taping through the news media. And you have to be very proud, and I'm sure that you were very sorry the fact that he has not been able to see you taking up his role, and myself being able to be a congresswoman, because I'm sure that he would have been very proud for both of So, I wanted to ask you basically about the prisoners that we know that we have 36 minors, more than 1,000 political prisoners. Is there anything different right now with the torture practices? Are they doing any? We've always known that jail is one of those repressive methods. Is there something different right now for the Patio Vida people, for the participants in the July 11th?
Thank you. Thank you for that recognition of my father's life and legacy. I truly believe that this verdict of the Inter-American Commission is, well, it's essential, not only because it brings us closer to justice, and only closer because we have recognition of the truth, but all of us here today, we know that real justice will be served the day that the dream of freedom and democracy of my father be a reality for the Cuban people. But this verdict is a recognition not only of the crime against him and Harold, but a recognition of all the victims, past and present, of that regime. And the current victims, the more than 1,000 political prisoners that are in jail right now, are enduring the most harsh possible conditions. There are several of them that are incommunicados inside prison, so they are basically disappeared. We don't know if they live or they died. That's the case of Mario Alberto in Havana. That was the case of Jose Daniel Ferrer for more than 3 months. And now, when his wife goes to visit, as if we were in, I don't know, the 16th century, the authorities took the wife to the door of the cell in which Jose Daniel is, just for her to see that he's still alive. A few minutes, and that's all. And maybe we have to wait another month to see if Jose Daniel is alive or not. There is another very concerning situation, and it's that the Cuban state security apparatus that have been emulated by Daniel Ortega and by Maduro, and that actually coordinates the counterintelligence in Venezuela, is trying to blackmail and coerce the Cuban political prisoners, trying to force them to accept the exile instead of the unconditional freedom that they are asking for. And this is very important, and I'm talking about this because Daniel Ortega did just that with 200 Nicaraguan political prisoners. And the US, I'm sure that with very good intentions, and other countries in the world somehow enabled that process. When we accept, when the international community accepts that blackmail, and when that happens, what we are doing is that we're sending the message to these dictators that they can bargain with our backs, that they can use Cuban, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, political prisoners as currency. So
I've always said that Fidel Castro Sherman, he wrote the book. He wrote chapter 1, chapter 10, and then he sent the book with the different chapters of how to repress to Nicaragua and Venezuela in exchange of cash, oil, or other commodities. Thank you. Now, and thank you, Rafael, for your service. Muchas gracias por su servicio, por estar aquí, estar explicando. Muchas gracias. Un honor estar en su presencia. Orlando, you're as sharp as when you were on the air with me, so I think now you're sharper. Can you just explain to us a little bit about these Black Berets? How many are they? Why are they so well trained? Why are they so loyal to the regime? Where do they come from? Do they eat? Do they families? Because I'm sure the families can't eat 3 times a day. 80% of the Cuban population eats only once a day, according to the United Nations. So eating 3 times a day and eating properly is an incentive, I would imagine, for them to perform and to continue being loyal. So can you give me a little bit more stats?
Well, first of all, the picture you showed brought back tremendous memories. I had the honor of driving Oswaldo for that interview. And I was there while you two were speaking, so it was a tremendous moment. Some of the information you asked for, Congressman, I don't have.
All right.
Fidel Castro set up parallel militaries to guarantee his permanence in power. One is the regular armed forces, the other is the Ministry of the Interior.
Right.
The Ministry of the Interior has at least two mini armies within. One is the Personal Guard, which takes care of all the high-ranking regime members. That's a force they have.
Right.
The general who led that for years mysteriously died after July 11, 2021, Francis Park. It was said he was disgruntled and he was expressing a need for change in Cuba, and then his death was suddenly announced.
Right.
He wasn't buried as a hero, he was quickly forgotten. The other are the Black Berets. The Black Berets is an evolution of different units the regime has had over the years, and what I know from evidence we've gathered from Nicaraguans, they actively participated in suppressing the Nicaraguan uprising in 2018. What we know is that Black Beret unit commanders were in Venezuela with Iranian commanders, where they learned many of the innovations of the Iranians for putting down popular uprisings.
So they're being exported to Nicaragua and to Venezuela. That's
They're
what
being,
you're telling me.
yes, and now to Ukraine and now to Belarus.
Right, right.
So they're being trained in all the innovations of putting down an insurgency. The use of snipers to put down peaceful protests as an Iranian invention, which was used again in Nicaragua. If you look at the pictures of the Chinese trainers with the Black Berets, they're holding sniper rifles. So what are they being taught to do is right? They're being taught that to use in Cuba or wherever they're sent. We saw these troops again used just a month ago in the protests in Montana and Camanera. They're the ones who go in and break up the protests. So they're the Praetorian Guard of the regime. They're very well armed, very well fed, very well trained, and they're intrinsically regime's survival. And I just want to add one more thing. You're all very courageous leaders for the cause of a free Cuba. And I think that, not you, but in Washington, this idea that the regime is accidentally authoritarian, this idea that the regime was not a threat to U.S. national security, which Fidel Castro and Ana Montes disseminated to us, this idea has made some key concepts anathema. You can't talk about liberation. You can't talk about regime change. The regime survives based on ambiguities. I think that liberation should be on the table. I think regime change needs to be on the table because the regime will never conceal power. They've committed too many crimes against humanity. They know what they've done. And they know that they have no future in a democratic country. So I think it's important. The U.S. is the only country in the world that has two standing laws that recognize the inherent right of Cubans to be free. The Joint Resolution of 1898 and the Libertad, and Public Law 8773. I think it's important that that be used as a legal instrument, as a platform, for recognizing the right of the Cuban people to fight for their liberation.
Very short. I'm very impressed by all the presentations here, and I'm very grateful to be here. But what we're saying, and I see that you're concerned about the Black Beret, but I'm going to Vietnam, Angola, in 1985. Cuba had 55,000 troops in Angola fighting on the communist side, and 10,000 in Ethiopia. So why are we so surprised? It's been going on forever. And we fail to recognize it. That's the big problem. Nobody recognizes Cuba for the monster it is. How long was Montes in the Defense Department making decisions on Cuba policy? I mean, we fail to recognize the reach and impact that Cuba is having all over the place. And I refer back to a letter Fidel Castro wrote when he was in the mountains to Celia Sanchez. It's read, when this war is over, then I'll start my real war against the United States. That's in the mountains. And so, what we have failed, in my opinion, and we need to do better, is to have the public opinion, which is not an easy task, to realize what we just expressed here. Because we can talk to ourselves until we're retired or dead or whatever, but we need to convince other people. So
And that's why we're here.
That's what we're here.
Thank you for everything. Oh, I forgot. We are paying
You're looking at Mario.
by the American Health Organization. It's $600 million, I think, a year. And what is it used for? To take the Cuban doctors to Brazil and
To Mexico.
Not for long.
We're defunding that as well.
We're so glad that we have people like you guys.
Mr. Moskowitz, the man in charge of putting your father's sign up in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
That's right, right in front of the Cuban embassy.
Exactly.
So this is for anyone on the panel, because I think you mentioned that you're talking to like-minded people.
Yeah.
But we have colleagues, and there are Americans who want to normalize relations with Cuba. So what would you say to those folks that read the misinformation, or who believe that our policies have failed and that we should normalize relations? How do we explain to those people that they're wrong, and here's why?
That's correct.
They're traitors.
The Cuban cartel is the enemy of the United States. You cannot normalize relationships with an enemy. There's nothing that we can give them that will help them. We can give them money, but we cannot even lend it to them because they do not pay it back. So they have exhausted all possibilities. They can't secure financing. They cannot secure it. They're totally failed government. They can, by their own means, they can improve the lot of their people without any influence from the United States. You know, they can get agricultural going and they can feed their people. They won't do it. They have no interest in securing their well-being. Why would we normalize relations with a government like that? They are criminals. And we can give you a list of the crimes. Why do we need to normalize business? And they are our enemy. We don't normalize relations with our enemy. Look what under President Obama, when they tried to normalize relations with Cuba, and look what happened. Look where we were answered. Okay? It didn't work, and it's never going to work.
My father, he used to say, well, because this is not the first time. I mean, capitalism going back to Cuba have been solved by the Cuban regime 3-4 times in the last 30 years. And to those that are always willing to extend a hand to the regime instead of the people. My father used to say that if you want to extend a helping hand to the Cuban people, you should start by demanding that the Cuban people have their hands on time. We want to stretch that help. All of us want to do that. The Cuban people want to be friends with the United States, with the people, and with the government. The thing is that that's never going to happen under communism. And there is nothing that the U.S. can do while engaging with those killers that is going to prevent those killers to try to threaten, destabilize, and cause damage to the U.S. There is nothing that you can do while engaging with them that is going to prevent them for their advancing their agenda with China, with Russia, with Iran. Not till the U.S. is ready to use conditional language and to use conditional actions. That's on the law of this country, and that could be even that could be for perfection, and that's what we are asking. We ask for targeted sanctions. That's what we're asking when we ask for maximum pressure over those that are taking the decisions from the top of that mafia that Rafael was mentioning. And I'm gonna end with this. That regime that has the intelligence services with the more influence in our continent, far beyond CIA in our continent, that regime is actually a very fragile regime. All that requires is real coordinated international pressure in support of the Cuban people. Our joint efforts, the Cuban people and the international community and the US, we can break them down. And we can break them down soon. And that's essential. That's essential if we want peace, prosperity, stability in Latin America, the stop to the threat of the United States, and human rights and democracy for the people.
No, actually, no questions. But I do want to just add to what was just said. The goal is not sanctions. The goal is freedom. And so, in history of humanity, I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but it's true. History of humanity. What has never worked is unilateral concessions in exchange for, right? And so that doesn't work in America. It doesn't work in foreign policy. It just doesn't. So it's interesting about what is the U.S. policy vis-a-vis Cuba. Its sanctions go away immediately once a handful of conditions are met, which really can be boiled down to three conditions: the liberalization, the freeing of all political prisoners. And is that something that the Cubans don't discuss? Before we, for example, weaken sanctions. Number two is for allowing for some basic freedoms, and they're in the law, but it's freedom of press, independent labor unions, political parties, and then start the process towards it. So here's the fundamental question to those that say we should normalize. Fine. Which one of those three conditions do you not support? Those that advocate for it? And which one of those three conditions? So I think your question really is hugely important. It's fundamental. I'm glad that you brought that up. And I just basically asked very simple, which is, should we unilaterally ask nothing in return for our national security interests for the Cuban people? Just give up sanctions, or should we condition it on something? And I think most human beings will say, no, we should probably condition it on something. So then the question is, all right, which one of these three conditions does our national security interest not deserve, and do the Cuban people not deserve? So thank you for that question, because I think it's a fundamental question.
It is.
I yield back. Michael?
Yeah, I just one question, and I know Rafael was I welcome your thoughts. Outside support for the regime. There's discussion of loosening sanctions on Maduro, allowing their oil back into the market. Can you talk about how that directly then benefits and that lifeline that Maduro offers to the Castro regime? And if you could just spend another minute or two really elaborating for everyone watching how the European support in this false promise of engagement is helping the regime in its oppression.
I want to say this. First of all, it's important to understand that the regime in Havana, Ortega's dictatorship, and Maduro's regime are the same thing. They are the same unit. They're run by the same people. Their repressive strategy is run from Havana. The FSLN was created in Cuba. And Ortega is seen as a child of the Cuban Revolution. So any concession to any of those, that triad, is a concession to the entire triad. If you loosen on Maduro, you help the communist regime in Cuba. If you tighten the belt on the regime in Cuba, you weaken the Sandinistas and the Maduro dictatorships, because they function as a unit. They function as a platoon. With regards to European financing, this is what is most dangerous. The Spanish government, mostly under the Socialist Workers' Party of Spain, speaks a language of freedom and of being part of the free world, and then does everything it can to aid and abet the dictatorship in Cuba. Mr. Borrell was recently in Cuba, the de facto foreign minister for the European Union. All he had was praise for that regime. The same week they announced that Cuban troops were in Ukraine and that units were being sent for training in Belarus. What's at the bottom of that? It's a mix of colonialist nostalgia and ideological interest. And I think it's very important to be put on the table with the Europeans. You can't finance these regimes, abet these regimes, and aid them, and then claim that you're against Russia. I think it's very important to do that. And I think the $8.1 billion given to that regime by the Club of Paris. Given because they forgive them the loan. And 155 million euros per year to 80 different projects, which means 80 different organizations that are run by the regime are getting money, is what's keeping the regime with the ability and the capabilities of countering the uprising of the regime. I think these numbers have to be looked at. What does that kind of money mean for the regime? So a regime that has wrecked the Cuban economy, that hasn't had, that purposely bankrupted one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America in 1959. What does that mean for the regime? Lastly, and to show the catastrophe that regime has been for Cuba, the embargo doesn't cover food. In 1959, Cuba fed itself and exported agricultural products to the U.S. Cuba was an agricultural powerhouse. Like Rafael Montalvo said, very fertile soil, unique in Latin America. Today, Cuba imports 85% of what it eats from the United States. So that regime wrecked the Cuban agriculture to maintain itself in power. It's not a result of any sanctions. And the money from the Europeans is keeping that bankrupt regime function. And it's time to end it. It's time to bring that to a close.
That 8.1 billion is over what period of time?
Over 5 years. I mean, the Club of Paris handles public funds that are going to countries who are developing. I mean, the regime continues to default on these loans, and in the leadership of France, the Club of Paris keeps on giving them money. That's not working together in tandem with the U.S. to achieve democracy.
Michael, our sanctions on Russia, if we had secondary, they would block who would sanction that money from going to Cuba. I'm Debbie?
That's
Thank you.
Some of these called sanctions that are unpopular with the left are not really sanctions at all. I mean, I'm sure you know that Cuba has a series of warehouses and businesses at the Colón area in Panama, and that they've been operating forever. And they import everything from the United States and they send it back to Cuba. And the additional cost maybe is 2 cents for transportation. That's it. So in addition to that, they do things. I don't know if you've seen that there are now brand new Camaros and Mustangs and so on riding around in Cuba. And it goes into the nature of the regime. Those cars are cars that were stolen here in Miami and collected the insurance from them, and the cars were taken and broken into parts and shipped to Cuba as part of the allowed help in automobile parts to Cuba. They're assembled, but now the regime people have Camaros and Mustangs. They are not the government, they're groups, and they're enemies. And we have to get everybody's mentality on that.
And moving, I just want to say something, moving to the social scene. I looked at Funky, he's Afro-Cuban. The overwhelming majority of the people who are in jail are Black. Those people who are being beaten, you understand, right? Those people who have been beaten on the streets in July 11th, the overwhelming majority of them are Afro-Cubans. Debbie and Moskowitz, you can help me. Specifically, I went to the Black caucus in the Democratic Party, and I said we may have big differences on the embargo, on Fidel. Let's don't look at any of that right now, but I want you to help me the same way that you're helping George Flores. We have Jorge Flores on the streets of Atlanta.
Maria, I actually hosted a briefing.
And you did.
Yeah,
So
with the Black Caucus in the last Congress, with a Princeton professor, an Afro-Cuban Princeton professor who walked the Black Caucus members and leadership, including Clyburn, ranking African American. In that Congress, we have Dr. Jeffries as well, who also attended, to underscore the particular brutality. 70% of Cubans on the island are Afro-Cubans today. I mean, that is the proportion. And the Cuban regime maintains that they've eradicated racism, but they do that while they say that while they're banning Black and Afro-Cuban activist groups, and specifically banning those organizations from existing. And I just, if I can take just a couple of minutes to ask particularly Dr. Boronat.
But just to finish, I would like to, now that we have this platform, to secure your support and create a bipartisan effort. I mean, there are no parties here. We're defending the same Afro-Cubans that are being beaten on the streets of the United States or in the streets of the
Is there a Cuba is there a Cuba caucus?
So I just would like to.
Mario and I actually co-chair the Cuba Democracy Conference.
So maybe that should be and prove that there are no flags here when it comes to defending the rights of the Afro-Cubans.
Right, I just want you to know that conversation has been started.
So we should continue.
Which is why, in our caucus, you've not seen a snowball of desire to lift sanctions. And it's why, we are not in the same situation in Congress today that we were when I came to Congress, and particularly back in the 2006 era, when.
Do not minimize the importance of your leadership, your personal
That's not
leadership.
what I raised it.
I know, I'm telling you, you cannot minimize the importance of Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman personal leadership on this issue. I've witnessed it, and so again, I thank you for yielding me, but I think it's important to note that your leadership has been instrumental. So
Thank you.
yield.
I'm glad that you are mentioning that because thank you.
That's not why I raised it. I just want you to know that the groundwork has begun to be laid, because it is most African Americans in this country don't realize the huge percentage of Afro-Cubans there are on the island today, and the disproportionate repression that they are subjected to. And when we have an opportunity, we should do more of that kind of discussion, so that there is greater understanding, because it is that understanding. And I want to do this just. I want to go through myth, fact. Myth. The Cuban regime represents that they have unrivaled education on the island that ensures that anything is possible for Cubans. They maintain that they have unrivaled healthcare access for all Cubans on the island, and that when you have a healthcare issue, you're immediately able to go and get that taken care of. And there's no better healthcare system in the world, or certainly not in the region. They've recently been pushing that we have a robust private sector, burgeoning private businesses that anyone in Cuba can begin and then profit from. There's so much absence of economic opportunity. It would boggle the mind. The enslavement of Cuban doctors, who are exported as their almost main economic import for resources. They're enslaving Cuban doctors over our region, in other countries, with the support and undergirding of Russia and now China and Iran. And so if you could so I laid out the myths. What's the reality? Because the key for making sure that we can maintain the sanctions, in my experience, and maintain that we need to not just lift everything and then once the island is open, everything will be fine. When our colleagues have that more ingrained in what their actual knowledge and awareness is, they change their minds. We have to make sure they understand they're only getting one side of the story. And that's because most of them don't represent a Cuban community like we, a Cuban American community like we do here. And so can you help shed some light on those myths and what the reality is?
Well, yes, certainly. And we greatly admire your leadership and your principles. Thank you.
I promise that's not why I'm
I know, but if I have opportunity to say it, it's my chance to say it, and I'm telling you, we really admire you. Thank you for standing as you stand for Cuba through years. So Mario expresses the sentiment of an entire community that really respects how you stand on Cuba. Even against your own I want to say some basic numbers here. In 1955, Cuba had more doctors per capita than the United Kingdom. In 1955, Cuba had more neurosurgeons than England did. In the first 20 years after independence, Cuban literacy rates increased over 100%, mostly benefiting Black Cubans. The term Afro-Cuban covers a lot of different skin colors in Cuba. It's a far more syncretic culture than the U.S. is. And the fact is that since 1959, Cuba has been ruled by a small cartel of white males who have imposed a top-down dictatorship in Cuba. You can't write the history of the Cuban Republic without the leadership of Black Cubans. Cuba had the most politically strong and economically strong black middle class of Latin America. It was crushed by the regime. The regime, the first year, outlawed the black self-help associations. That is never mentioned. You can't write the history of the anti-Castro movement without black Cubans. Hernando Oliva, Tony Izquierdo, Tomás Cruz, José Peñalver. And I can keep on mentioning. They were the leaders of that. Why? Why were black Cubans rebelling on the front lines against this regime? Because they came to end a republic that may have been imperfect, but it really strove to end racism with freedom. So there's so many facts. If someone honestly wants to listen to it and study it, they'll see that this regime is a corrupt regime that has used the spin of social justice to justify dictatorship. No other government in the history of Cuba, no other government in the history of Latin America has set up concentration camps for homosexuals, as the regime did. And for over a decade, dozens of Cubans were sent to concentration camps because they were hippies, because they were gay, because they were Jehovah's Witnesses, because they were seminarians in the Catholic Church. This is a type of repression Latin America has never seen. So, to me, it's incredible that after so many years, people still repeat the same myths. Which leads me to think that some people believe whatever they want to believe against the facts. But there are also honest people, as you mentioned, that need to know those facts and need to see the reality of what Cuba is.
We need to use the Cuba Democracy Caucus.
Let me add to what you just said.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Let me add to what you just said. The problem is, Benjamin, is a problem that we have. And the problem is that the public communications here are dominated by the Castro regime propaganda. They own Wikipedia. If you go to any university today, I know I have a grandson in Williams. He did an essay on the Bay of Faith, very informed, and he got an F because he didn't use the source material.
You're
The
so
source
good at
material was, my God. The source material was horrible, and it's all over like that. We receive 30, 40 people every day. We give classes to teachers, to public school teachers. We've had like 200 this month on them. We're trying to straighten out the story, starting with what Cuba was before Castro. The information is not there. Europeans, Middle Easterners, they're much more informed about Cuba's history, more open to it. We have listened to their propaganda here, and so we need to change that. And the only way we can change that with a massive information approach.
Change hearts and minds.
Before we gain the ears of all of these people to get support, we need to get into their heads with the right information, and we need to put that together.
Thank you so much. Before our press conference, we have a short video by a dissident in Cuba. Named is Ivan Hernandez Carrillo. He's also an Afro-Cuban, and if we'll, it's about 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Don't worry, guys, I know how to work a mouse.
All right.
Great. So I guess we will be sending the video. Apologies for having some technical issues. We'll just be sending it to everybody. Obviously, we have your emails because of the RSVP. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Wesley, we're going next door, is that correct?
Yes, sir. So
Right.
for just the press conference next door is just for members of the media. So if you're a member of the media, then you can come next door. But for everybody else, thank you guys so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
The members should come out this way.
Thanks to all of you. I'm going to be around. I'm going to